So to get us started with the first question, in the 1970s, the prison population in the United States was about 200,000. And today, about 50 years later, it is standing at around 2 million, which makes it the largest prison population in the entire world. What happened? How did we get here?
Yeah, so a lot of things happened, right? And I think we can date the meteoric rise of mass incarceration in the United States to around 1973. Right, the various historians and organizations, have produced charts where you can see, right, that the graph starts its uptick around 1973 and keeps going. I think it's important, though, to note that a lot of the dynamics that led to that were already in place by 1973. Right? Were already being unfolded by that time. So throughout the 1960s, you have, even though the rate of incarceration is relatively stable, the demographics of incarceration are shifting. So what that means is that you have a lot more and more Black people in particular going to prison, as well as, depending on where in the country we're talking about, Chicano, Puerto Rican, Indigenous people going to prison, and fewer white people going to prison. So the demographics are shifting, and the response to that is a lot of very sort of spurious and troubling language from prison administrators about a quote unquote new breed of inmate, and troubles inside the prison system, and a need to get tough, right, both in the prison system and in the country at large. Outside of prison, of course, this is the time period of the civil rights movement, of the Black Power movement, of hundreds of urban rebellions and uprisings against inequality in both big cities and small cities and towns all around the country, which also generates this, intense, what becomes a sort of law and order politics, right? And law and order moves its way from a kind of fringe element of conservative politics on the right to be ultimately a kind of bipartisan consensus, right? The parties trying to demonstrate their toughness, or demonstrate how much they are law and order. And so a lot of these dynamics that are unfolding in the 1960s that give us first the war on crime that Lyndon Johnson declares in 1965, that start to sort of funnel a lot more funding and resources to police departments around the country. Meanwhile, a lot of those police departments are responding to protests and critiques of inequality by demanding more resources, right? by police are organizing themselves politically to exert more influence in the political process. And so by the time we get to the 70s and the start of the war on drugs, we've have a kind of concentration of law and order politics that has ever since been exploded in a thousand different ways at both national and local levels.
Yeah, the timing of Johnson's war on crime is interesting, of course, right? Because it comes the same year as the Voting Rights Act.
Yep.
And it does seem like there is this moment in which the federal government is just like, all right, enough on reform. This has gone too far, and really shifts toward a different politics. So how much do you see the response to protest in the streets and activism in the 1960s and carrying into the 1970s as being a spur for the creation of a new politics that eventually became mass incarceration?
Yeah, I think it plays a hugely significant role, right? And I think it plays a role in a couple of different registers. I always tell my students, all of our heroes, right, all of the famous people and the notable people, and lots of the non-famous people that we associate with the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement had criminal records, right? These are people who were violating the law, right? So oftentimes quite deliberately, at an act of political protest against segregation and other racist laws, but also in sort of quote unquote non-political ways, right? In the ways that lots of young people get in trouble, but get in trouble, backed by a sort of racist state, so that Rosa Parks goes to jail for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. Malcolm X, before he's Malcolm X, goes to prison for a series of robberies and other crimes that help send him on his journey to becoming Malcolm X, right? So you have these different kind of pathways, but where people from different sides of, or different kind of tendencies and trajectories within the Black freedom struggle all have experience with the criminal legal system and are all challenging that, right? And I think the response is a kind of doubling down on the legal system that is particularly amplified by a lot of segregationist politicians. I'm a big fan of the political scientist Naomi Morikawa, who wrote that the US did not confront a crime problem that was racialized, but a race problem that was criminalized, right? And she tracks a lot of the response dating back to the 1950s of, starting with Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans, the response to civil rights protests as a threat to law and order, right? That responding to, she has this other line about that these political figures were saying integration breeds crime. And this is, and Barry Goldwater really makes that a centerpiece of his campaign in 1964. And one thing I always stress with my students is that Johnson beats Goldwater in this historic landslide, and then a year later adopts one of his most damning and damaging platforms by declaring a war on crime. And even though he does it, with some different inflections on Goldwater, it ended up bolstering what became the carceral apparatus by unimaginable figures.
There's an interesting, there's a politics here.